All right, are you able to see my screen now, Julie?
Yes.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting us to come and talk with the group today. We're going to be talking about the effects of beaver dams on low flow hydrology, temperature, and fish movement in the Minnesota Lake Superior tributaries, particularly the Knife and the French River. And so Josh and I are here talking today, but we're talking on behalf of a number of colleagues, which include Dr. Sally Diamond, Dr. Becky Teasley, both at UMD. We had a couple graduate students who worked on this project, Emma Bergeson, Hannah Behar, and Nick Peterson. And then Alex Nazaro and Sarah Mitchell were both at the College of the Holy Cross and were able to get involved in this project thanks to COVID. So they're in Massachusetts working on this project. And then of course, I also want to thank Sea Grant who funded this. So beavers, as many of you know, are a ubiquitous presence in North Shore streams. And as ecosystem engineers, they can have really profound influences on riverine landscapes. They fundamentally alter habitat from stream to pond. They open up the canopy by removing woody vegetation and create openings allowing sunlight to reach the ponds. They can create longitudinal barriers for movement of fish upstream or downstream, and they can alter the hydrology of the system by raising the water table and shifting the timing of how and when water moves downstream. So the Knife River, where this study took place, hosts a lot of spawning habitat for rainbow trout, which are also known as steelhead along the North Shore. Many streams have barrier falls that are preventing upstream migration of those spawning steelhead, but the Knife does not, and that makes it a really valuable resource for anglers. This leads to management practices that optimize steelhead survival growth and reproduction. And one of those management practices involves removing beavers and beaver dams from mainstem channels within the Knife River watershed. So we got involved in this project because local citizens were concerned that these management practices, and they were worried that in removing the dams, low flows were being negatively impacted. So what do we know about how beavers impact flows? Well, we know that beaver dams could impact low flow hydrology, they could impact temperature downstream, and they can impact fish movement. And fundamentally, if we found that beaver dams are creating a barrier to movement, warming downstream temperatures, and causing lower low flows, then removing those beaver dams makes sense, particularly if steelhead habitat is your primary concern. But we don't actually know all of those links. And what if it turns out that removing the beaver dams was actually causing problems downstream? If we find that, for instance, that beaver dams are cooling the water downstream and improving low flows, removing them might be having a detrimental impact on the same species that you're trying most to help. So that's where this project came in. Could we provide some more data on how beaver dams in the Knife River are impacting low flow hydrology and fish movement? Or to be more specific, how does beaver dam removal impact those? Most of our project focused on those specific aspects of beaver dam presence and absence. The impact of dams on temperature wasn't originally part of the project, but since we were out in the field and we had access to several dozen temperature sensors from the NRRI, we decided to deploy them in and around beaver dams to see if we could measure the impact they had on temperature as well. And we also had a graduate student who was super interested in modeling heat flux. So we were able to instrument a handful of beaver dams in great detail to learn more about the temperature regime and what processes impacted temperature. So most of the work that I'm going to talk about today focuses on the low flow and temperature data, and then Josh is going to pick up and talk about the fish movement around dams. So let's say a few words about how beaver dams and dam removal might impact flow and temperature. So this slide was put together by one of my students, Hannah Behar, to illustrate the main fluxes in a beaver dam system. So I want you to think about this, first of all, from a hydrologic perspective. By impounding the water, a few things happen. First of all, you might increase the evaporative flux to the atmosphere because you have a greater surface area exposed. And this would lead to less water being available downstream. However, by impounding that water, the system is providing storage that might not otherwise exist. And so that can allow water to be held longer in the system, potentially augmenting low flows later in the season. So instead of water just washing downstream during a flood event, more of it's held upstream to be available later in the season. In addition, the presence of the pond itself raises the water table, and that creates a higher hydraulic head and greater flux of water into the subsurface. So we're increasing that storage reservoir as well. And with that increase of hydraulic head, subsurface flows through the hyporheic zone can be enhanced, and that can lead to increased flows downstream. So clearly the impacts on low flow are complicated and they're often sort of contradictory, which is why we set up this study. We don't know the answer ahead of time. Now let's think about temperature. How might these impoundments impact temperature? Well, the evaporative flux from the pond is increased, and that actually leads to cooling of the pond. But solar radiation to the pond is increased, and that leads to warming of the pond. And most of our temperature sensors found that the surface waters could be quite warm, but the temperatures near the bed were often remaining quite cool. With that increase in the subsurface flux, so the water going down into the subsurface, you can get an overall cooling effect from the pond on downstream waters. But if you have water flowing over the top of the dam, then you can get warming downstream because those warm surface waters are going downstream. So once again, the impacts are complicated and contradictory, which is why we set up this study. So let me go through a little bit of information about the study design. We set it up to be a classic BACI design, before after control impact. We had 4 paired watersheds within the Knife River. We had 2 sets in each geomorphic regime. Let me explain what I mean about that. We separated the watershed into the upper watershed. These 3 pictures up at the top are taken from that area. It's a low gradient hummocky landscape, has loamy soils, greater depth to bedrock. And then the lower watershed, which is sort of the steeper area that was covered by Glacial Lake Duluth near the end of the last glaciation. So these 3 photos at the bottom come from the lower watershed. This area is more clay rich. It has Glacial Lake Duluth glacial lacustrine sediments, overlying tills. The depth to bedrock's a lot shallower, and you often find bedrock in the channel. There's plenty of beavers in both locations. So the way the study was set up, we were looking at a whole bunch of small headwater streams. All of the basins had active beaver dams in 2018. Then in 2019, and so we monitored them throughout the monitoring season in the summer of 2018. In 2019, the beavers were removed and the dams were notched in half of the sites. So those are our impact sites. Those are the T's, or treatment sites. Then the low flow hydrology and temperature could be compared before and after dam removal on the impact and the control watersheds. We also did a fish movement mark and recapture study. We had some sites on the Knife that overlapped with our hydrology sites, and then also a number of sites on the French River. So in each of our 8 subwatersheds, remember we have 4 pairs of 2 subwatersheds, we instrumented the downstream most beaver pond, the stream, and the floodplain. We tracked water level with pressure transducers, and we collected data necessary to develop rating curves to determine downstream discharge. So we could determine the amount of water coming out of the system. We also collected water samples to analyze stable isotopes of oxygen and hydrogen, and that provides information to track hydrologic flow paths, that I'm not going to talk about the isotope data today. And in addition, we installed a lot of temperature sensors, both within the ponds as well as upstream and downstream. And we put extra sensors in the downstream channels to track the water temperatures downstream of the beaver impoundments to see how they changed when the dams were removed in the second year. And then lastly, we had two of our control sites, so 2 of the sites that had beaver dams in both years, we instrumented more heavily to look at water and heat flux in and around the beaver dam. Oops, too far. So let's go through some of the methods in more detail. To measure the low flow discharge, we installed pressure transducers in the streams, and then we corrected those data to remove variations in atmospheric pressure. And this gives you data of stream depth. So that's over here on the right-hand side, you can see essentially a summer's worth of data. We then went out during different discharges, so different river levels, and collected discharge data and stage height data to develop rating curves. And that allowed us to take the stream depth information and turn it into discharge over the course of the monitoring season. We then analyzed those discharge records to determine low flow metrics. And the first thing we learned is that studying low flow is really hard. So it's a lot less well defined than studying peak flows or flood events, and you really only get 1 low flow point per year. We ended up using a series of different thresholds to define low flow, so that, because there isn't really one that's been established. And then we compared the amount of time the basin spent below that threshold in year 1 and year 2. So the thresholds that we used included base flow after 3 weeks of no rain, the 75th percentile flow. This is what the DNR defines as low flow. And what this means is that 75% of the time the river is higher, has higher flow than the 75th percentile flow. We figured that out based on the Knife River gauge down at the mouth, and then scaled it to our small watersheds in two different ways. One, we scaled them by basin area, and the other, we scaled it by discharge. And then we also determined a composite threshold where we tried to combine all three together. And I'm not going to talk about that one today, but I will show the data from the other three. So how did we actually use the data? Because we essentially have only one data point for time spent below flow each year in our subbasin, our goal was to use each of those 4 sites as replicates, and we could look for trends in behavior from year 1 to year 2. So this is how we use the Bakke study design to do this. So we used year 1 to set our baseline relationship between the control and the treatment basin. So in the example that I've got here, let's say year 1, both the control and the treatment basin spent 30 days below our low flow threshold. The idea is that then in year 2, we remove the beavers from one of the sites, the treatment site, and then we compare how many days the 2 basins spend below low flow in the second year. What's important is not the number of days. You can see in both cases, they went from 30 days to 60 days for the control and 90 days for the treatment. So in both cases, they went up. It means it was drier in year 2. But what's important is the ratio between them and how that changes from year 1 to year 2. So in this case, the ratio went from 1 to 1 to 1 to 1.5. So we can plot the relationship between the treatment and the control variable in each year, in the first year, and then in the second year, and then look at how the slope of that line changes. So in the case I have here, the slope has increased from the first year to the second year. What that means is that you have an increase in the number of days spent under low flow conditions after treatment. And so it would indicate that removing the dams might be detrimental to the fish because the flows dropped. So here are the results from the 3 different low flow thresholds. The first thing you might notice is that the relationships seem to be all over the map. However, some of them are statistically significant, quite statistically significant, and some of them are not. If you take the ones that are statistically significant and the ones that have a statistically significant difference between the years, we're really only left with the precipitation-free threshold. It has a statistically significant difference in slope between 2018 and 2019. The slope increased from between the first year and the second year, and that indicates that removing the dams led to more time spent at low flow in the second year. So that's sort of a quick summary of the discharge data. Let me talk a little bit about the temperature data. So even though we weren't originally focusing on temperature, we were able to explore the impacts of the beaver dam removal on temperature in 2 different ways. And one of those was by installing a whole bunch of temperature sensors above, within, and below impoundments at all of our 8 sites. These data were analyzed by Alex Nazaro, the undergrad at College of the Holy Cross. So she went through and calculated the average daily air and stream temperatures in July and August, tallied up the cumulative hours spent in stressful or lethal conditions for rainbow trout, and then compared the control versus the treatment in 2018 and 2019. So here are the results from her study. So what you're looking at is the ratio of time spent at stressful or lethal temperatures between treatment and control in 2018 and 2019. So if we look at 2018 data in the first column here, 3 of the numbers are greater than 1. And what that means is that all but one of the sites had warmer temperatures than the treatment site in 2018. If the beaver dam removal increased the temperatures in the treatment sites relative to control, you would expect that number to go up. And it does in 3 out of the 4 sites. In one case, it goes way up. So this would seem to indicate that, whoops, I've gone too far. Indicate that removing the beaver dams doesn't actually cool the water down. And in many cases, it's warming the water up, which is detrimental to the cold water species downstream. I think it's important to note at this point that a lot of these streams spent hundreds of hours at stressful or lethal temperatures. So a lot of our study sites weren't in trout waters, right? We were further upstream, but they are upstream from trout waters, and you want to be sending cold water downstream to the areas where the trout are living. So it actually is important that the water upstream stays cold as well. So the other temperature-related research that was done by Hannah Behar for her master's thesis. Hannah studied 3 of the beaver complexes in 2 of our study basins. So we have site 2 up here and site 4 down here. And there's 2 different ponds in site 4. And apologies for the B versus C notation. We were still calling these Beaver sites versus treatment sites rather than control versus treatment. So 2B is 2C. Let me show you what Hannah did. So Hannah went to these sites and installed a series of temperature arrays that went down into the subsurface. This allowed her to see not just what the temperature was, but also whether water was upwelling or downwelling in that location. She used these data coupled with a lot of atmospheric sensors to track incoming solar radiation and wind and other factors that might influence the heat flux in this site, and looked to see what affected the temperature both within and downstream of the beaver ponds. What she found is that in 2 of the 3 beaver ponds that she studied, the water cooled downstream of the dam. And a lot of that was driven by subsurface flows. So she found downwelling in the pond and then upwelling downstream from the pond. And the one site where she did not see that was this lower pond at site B, where it actually had upwelling in the pond, which might have been related from downwelling in the upper pond. We aren't sure. But the other 2 definitely had a signal of cooler water downstream from the pond. These are some of the data from site 2B. There's a picture of it down at the bottom. What you're looking at here, 0.0 on the x-axis is the distance downstream. That's the dam. And so downstream is to the right and upstream is to the left. So the pond is located to the left here. The black line shows the mean or average temperature. The bars show the variance in the temperature. The blue line shows the minimum and the orange line shows the maximum. So one thing you can see is that as you go downstream from the dam, the temperatures cool. She found that water was downwelling within the pond and upwelling downstream from the pond. This one was particularly cool and more so than we expected, because this whole area downstream of the pond where the temperatures are cool, there aren't any trees here, so they're not providing shade. What we found is that, well, there was a strong upwelling signal, and then also the grasses were able to provide some shade. The water was a lot cooler than we expected down there. I'll show you the groundwater data for this site as well. These are groundwater levels. They were recorded downstream from the ponds. And what you're looking at, the black line is the control site. So that's this one that we have here, 2B. The treatment site is the gray line. Again, it's the difference between the 2, between the first year and the second year, that's important. So relative to the control site, the treatment groundwater levels dropped, or I guess relative to the treatment site, the control levels went up. Fundamentally, we saw a drop in groundwater levels in the paired basin where the dams were removed. And that sort of fits with what we know what beaver ponds do. They tend to dam up the flow and increase the groundwater levels. So let me sort of summarize the temperature and low flow data, and then I'm going to pass this on to Josh to talk about fish. So fundamentally, beaver dam removal can impact low flows and temperatures. On the flow side, we found that removing beaver dams increased the time spent at low flow using the one statistically significant low flow threshold. The results do depend in part on the threshold that is chosen. They were pretty complex. We saw that the groundwater levels in the upper watershed sites, so I showed you 2B, the other upland watershed also showed the same signal, that the treatment sites, the groundwater levels dropped after we removed the dams. We did not see that in the lower sites that had the shallower depth to bedrock. For temperature, we saw that in 3 out of 4 pairs, the temperatures increased after removing the dams. And we found that ponds that were feeding downstream waters via the subsurface were able to cool the river downstream. I also want to point out that site U2, that was the one, the 2B, was a classic example of an upland beaver pond system with elevated groundwater and cooler water downstream of the dam. What does this all mean? Well, when we take it in combination, the data do not support all of the reasons for removing beaver dams in the Knife River to benefit steelhead. Our data indicate that removing the dams can cause lower low flows and warmer temperatures downstream. And we'll hear in a few minutes about how they impacted fish movement. I do want to note there were a lot of limitations to this study. It's a 2-year study, which is really short for a BACI study. Ideally, you'd have multiple years before to establish baselines and multiple years after to assess the impact of the treatment. We only had 1 before and 1 after. We also only had 4 sites. You might have noticed there were only 3 dots on a lot of those plots because the pressure transducer blew out on one of our sites and we were unable to include it in the discharge study. These are some pretty big caveats. It might not be enough to change watershed management practices, but it's also worth pointing out the data don't support the current watershed practices as being beneficial to the cold water species. So I'm going to turn this over to Josh, and he's going to tell you about how low head dams affect fish movement. And I'm going to keep running the slides and we'll see how this works. So are you there, Josh?
I am here. I have one of the shaky internet connections and I've been frozen and locked out in the middle of talks before. So Karen's gonna advance when I ask her to. I also have a light shining right on my eyeballs. So I'm gonna wear my cap because that is starting to bother me. So I'm going to talk about the movement around dams. And when we were starting this study, we were doing some literature review and found that there's really limited data on beaver and trout interactions. So the expected outcomes are often not data driven. In one paper where natural resource managers were interviewed about how they viewed beaver dams as fish barriers, 78% of them indicating that they thought dams were barriers were not data driven. And it was mostly stating that these interactions were speculative rather than data driven interactions. Next, please, Karen. So when we see some dams up on the North Shore and you have the question on whether or not that's a fish barrier, we thought this would be a good opportunity in this project to not guess and let's get the data. And data generated in this project may inform future decision-making in Northeast Minnesota, as well as other regions in the Great Lakes with similar lake run trout and beaver interactions. And the whole point is really that some actual data may get folks with different opinions some common ground for discussion. And you can advance now. At the project outset, our expectation was that we were going to survey around project beaver dams that were selected for the hydrology and hydraulics research and look for the presence of young of the year steelhead, because that would tell us where the adult steelhead were traveling to. And if there weren't any young of the year steelhead above a dam, it would be an assumption we could make that the adults did not pass that dam. Next. But in reality, we found out that few of the beaver dams in the Knife River were actually in trout water. As Karen had mentioned before, we were working in far upstream reaches and many of them were not trout water. In 2018, we were doing surveys around the project dams, which on the little map are the white lines that's indicating the approximate dam locations. And the important colors to look for are green. That's where we found young of the year steelhead. And you notice that those green dots are not anywhere near the project dams. We had some fish assemblages around the dams that had other trout species like brook trout or brown trout, but most of the time these were populations of minnows. So the dams were high up in the headwaters, just where we weren't going to be able to answer this question as we intended because we didn't have the right fish populations around them. Next. So in 2019, we expanded the scope to include dams, not just in the Knife River, but also in the nearby French River, and include all species encountered. We were still picking beaver dams that had trout populations around them. Many of them had brook trout and age 1+ rainbow trout. So not the young of the year, but some larger rainbow trout that hadn't gone out to the lake yet. And so the other question that we had to tackle was, why are we picking these small dams? We had said low head or small dams, anything that was really less than a meter high or 3 feet. And the reason why is we simply didn't have the gear to work in larger ponds. We had to stick to wadable sections of rivers. And some of these beaver dams that are 4 or 5 feet tall, they have quite deep pools in the center, and there's no way you can walk around and effectively sample fish from those large ponds unless you have some special equipment. Next. So when we selected our smaller beaver dams that were 3 feet or less in height around places where we knew that there were trout, we picked 4 that were active beaver dams. So the beavers were maintaining them with sticks, mud, and grass, keeping the water level maintained. and 4 were inactive. So these were dams that were still creating some type of a barrier, but perhaps water was flowing through it, or it wasn't maintained actively. And so water just was spilling around through a place where it blew past the dam or something like that. And we also had paired control stations to evaluate normal movement of fish. And that's what this image is showing you. This is a riffle in the middle of 2 electrofishing stations. And when we did our electrofishing, we would put up block nets up and downstream to create a closed population of fish. And so if we went in and shocked fish above and below that riffle, gave them unique marks, and came back and shocked them again, we could tell if fish passed that riffle. Next. So here is a top-down view of an example study area. This one is on the Knife River, and the very top end of this was actually one of the hydrology and hydraulics project dams. The whole scope of this map is about 1 kilometer in distance. This part of the Knife is not managed for beaver. It's considered marginal trout water. We did catch brook trout in there. And in our second year, I believe we did find a couple of young of the year steelhead up there as well. This study reach is showing some green squiggles down at the bottom. Those are the paired control reaches, which are separated by a riffle. And then there's a span of river that isn't marked with anything until you get to these red dots and orange squiggles. The red dots are the dams that we were including in our fish movement study, and the greens or the orange squiggles are the electrofishing stations in between dams. Next. To collect fish, we used backpack electrofishing units. Fish were tagged in August and recaptured again in September. So between the French and the Knife River, we had a span of about 4 to 7 weeks between marking and recapture. And fish movement past dams or the control riffles was determined basically by their initial mark and where we recaptured them. Next. And how we marked fish was a visible implant elastomer. It's a mixture of a color and a hardener. It's injected into the fish by hand with a syringe, and it hardens into a rubber-like consistency. You put it just under the skin. Fish that were greater than 60 millimeters were anesthetized so they wouldn't be wiggling around. They were tagged, given a VIE tag, monitored for recovery, and released at the midpoint within the reach where they were collected. Next. Here's some photos showing what the VIE tag looks like in fish. We tagged in the marking surveys almost 400 trout. The trout were all tagged in the postocular space, which is kind of a little fleshy pad behind the eye, or in the dorsal fin membrane. Non-trout, which are mostly minnows, were tagged in the cheek, which is not shown in this image. The gill cover, which is the black-nosed dace that has an orange mark, and the leading edge of the dorsal fin membrane, which is the one on the bottom with a little red line. Next. A subset of our tagged fish also received a partial pelvic fin clip to determine rates of VIE tag loss. This was a new procedure to us, so we didn't know what to expect for tag loss. There's almost with any way that you tag fish, there's some tag loss. And reported use of this, it really varied on how much tag loss you would get. The fish, their bodies are able to push these tags out sometimes, and we didn't know how much of that to expect. So we did some additional marking of fish to make sure we could keep track of that. Next. At the dam sites, we monitored the water level with time-lapse photography. So there's 2 instrumentations that were left out all summer. The camera on a stake that took 1 hour time-lapse photos of the dam and that staff gauge out in the pond. And when we were doing our electrofishing, we measured the dams for length, width, height, and water depths around the dam. But really what turned out to be some of the best data were these images from the time-lapse photos. Next. For our data analysis, we tested for differences in fish movement among dam classes on whether they were active or inactive dams and against movement among the control reaches. We used proportional movement, which calculates the percent of fish moved based on the fish that are recaptured. And this can handle differential tag loss and capture efficiencies because it's based on what you recapture, not the entire sample of fish originally tagged. Then we looked for correlation of fish movement to covariates of time between mark and recapture, the interim cumulative precipitation, and interim flow conditions at dams from the time-lapse images. Next. In summary, of 1,200 tagged fish, we recaptured 248, which is a recapture rate of 21%. We had about 16% of our non-trout recaptured, and we did better with the trout, recapturing about 30% of those. So 90% of the recaptured fish, so this is of the 248 that we did recapture, 90% of those did not move from the reach they were originally tagged in. So they were marked in one place and 90% of them were recaptured 4 to 7 weeks later in the same place. No movement differences were detected between trout or non-trout, and we're really interested in the 10% of fish documented as moving over the study period, but that's 10% of 248 fish. So it's really only about 25 fish that we documented as moving. So keep in mind, the sample size is 25 fish. Next. When looking at the differences of inactive or active dams against control movement, there wasn't any significant difference. Active and inactive dams had about really no change between fish moving past those versus full reaches. In looking at dam height class, it looks like there's some more separation between the smaller dams, less than 50 centimeters in height, versus the larger ones greater than 50, but it wasn't significant, and neither of those height classifications are any different from the control reach movement. Next. So then we looked at correlations. Time between mark and recapture surveys had a significant positive correlation to fish upstream movement, which is showing in this, what I'm showing in this graph here is proportional movement on the y-axis and days until recapture on the x-axis. So the plot is over time, days between mark and recapture, how many fish moved upstream past a dam. Next. But the data are from different systems which experience different flows. And this is why I'm basically calling the time likely a red herring, something that's distracting, because the Knife River and French River are separated by about 2 weeks in time. And in that 2 weeks, we got about 2.5 or 3 inches of rain. And that's why there's a big gap. We couldn't work in the streams. We know that there was a lot of precipitation, but I didn't find any significant correlation with regional cumulative or max rainfall, mostly because the rainfall information is too coarse. But also, even if we had instantaneous rainfall or precipitation measures at the dams, it doesn't really work that way. It's the water that falls in the watershed upstream and when it comes down to the dam and how that water interacts with the dam. So when we looked at explaining fish movement, the next was flow conditions at the dams. This takes into account when the water is at the dam and how it's interacting with the dam, and also how the beavers are interacting with the dam as the water interacts with the dam, which I'll explain a little bit more as we go. So I reviewed time-lapse photos to determine the duration each dam experienced substantial overtopping flows. Next. So what is a substantial overtopping flow? It's not very well defined. So this is what I'm going to show you here, is designating substantial overtopping flow over 5 days in a period when we got about 2.5 inches of rain. These two dams are 20 meters apart. This is on the Knife River. On the left is Knife River Dam 1, which is 20 meters downstream of Knife River Dam 2. At this time, both dams are active. The beavers are actively maintaining them. So they are actually packed with mud and water barely flows over them somewhere, usually from the top somewhere. It's seeping over very, very like a trickle. The dams are not experiencing overtopping flow at this time. That's why there's a big no there on both image. All right, next. So we go 1 day in time. We step forward 1 day. We got rain overnight, and Knife River Dam 1 still doesn't have overtopping flows. In fact, overnight, the Beavers spent about 7 hours building that dam up higher and packing it with more grass and more mud so it would hold more water. When they did that, they flooded the dam upstream, Knife River Dam 2, and they gave up on building that one anymore. They just left it as a muddy berm and let the pond basically start covering it up. So that dam flipped from an active status to an inactive status, and it is experiencing substantial overtopping flows now. Next. I think about 2 days, this is a span of time, 2 more days later, we got a bunch more rain. Now Knife River Dam 1 is experiencing substantial overtopping flows, and Knife River Dam 2 is completely underwater. So this is what I was doing with the time-lapse images. I was finding when the dams were being substantially overtopped by high flows, documenting what time that was, advancing in the time series until they weren't experiencing overtopping flows. And I would take the number of hours that the dams were overtopped and just add those up. So dams with more time being overtopped by high water would have would show up on this next graph. So next. So this is what this next graph is showing, is the cumulative hours that dams were overtopped. So here I'm showing the x-axis is days with substantial overtopping flow. That's all of those hours added up. And the y-axis is all proportional movement of fish up or downstream. This is dam passage only. I took out the control reaches because, you know, essentially water was always flowing through those riffles. So there was no real separation of substantial overtopping flow or not with the riffles. So this is showing us that dam passage was best explained by the time each dam experienced overtopping flows, which is a function of precipitation and dam characteristics. Next. We observed brook trout, rainbow trout juveniles, and 6 minnow species passing dams upstream. There were 11 fish moving up, and downstream, 7 fish moved down. This pearl dace that I'm showing, that I'm holding in my hand there, actually passed this dam that I'm showing here on the bottom, side-by-side images of the same dam under different flow conditions. But our recapture rates were low with fish at 21%. And we had this question of, you know, what happened to all of our marked fish? Next. So there are some factors that affected recapture. For one, natural mortality is always possible with any field study where you're releasing fish back into a stream. There's always potential that they get eaten. We had great blue herons, American bittern, raccoons, all kinds of things were actually hunting directly from the beaver dams. And during the day or night, they would prowl the tops of the dams looking for food. So it's possible that some of these were eaten by fish-eating birds or other things. And we also experienced high flows when we were doing the fish recapture surveys. When you have higher flows, it makes your electrofishing equipment less effective. The water's flowing faster, so you miss fish. The water's usually a little more turbid, so you don't see them. And when I did the calculations, we were actually about 10 to 15% less efficient at capturing fish in our recapture surveys, which means in about every reach, we missed 10 to 15% more fish than we did during the mark surveys. And then we also expect that more fish were leaving our entire study areas than we had anticipated. And that's really what all of these pictures are showing here. The fish in the center is a creek chub that was actually marked down in a control reach where the star is on the map. And the dotted line is showing where it went. There's a big orange arrow that shows that it passed a dam. And this is the image of the dam that it passed in low flow conditions where there's basically a big clay berm separating a pool from an upstream portion where the stream continues, versus in higher flow conditions where you can see the water over that clay berm is almost continuous. So it's likely it passed in a high flow condition if we look at when the correlation of fish movement past dams. And then it continued up to another station that we actually electrofished. So we know that this fish moved 600 meters past an inactive dam and was captured somewhere else. But there's a lot of space in between where it was marked and recaptured where there's no survey stations at all. And we assume that there were other fish doing these larger movements ending up in places that we couldn't have sampled them with our set stations. Next. We also did have tag loss, and it differed by location that the fish was marked in. So when we put these VIE tags into the fish, I had said before, we had some of our stations where we paired that tag with a partial fin clip. And fish, if you do a partial fin clip, they regrow their fins quite fast. In some of the cases, we were looking at fish that had almost completely regenerated their fins over 4 weeks. So it's a temporary mark, but you can still tell when they've regenerated their fin. So in average, we had 32% loss in the non-trout, which was mostly minnows. We only had 10% loss of VIE tags in trout. So the trout tags stayed in a lot better. And that kind of makes sense. Trout have a little bit different scales and skin, and they're a little bit fattier, and there's more places for their tags to stay. The non-trout, which are mostly creek chubs and black-nosed dace and pearl dace, had a loss of about 6% in the cheeks. So that was a place that stayed really well. There's one image of a fish here that doesn't have a circle around its face. It's got a little red line. That's a fathead minnow tagged in the cheek. And minnows tagged in the dorsal fin were so-so. Half of them lost those tags. But the worst spot was the gill cover, 83% tag loss. So almost all of the minnows that were tagged right in the gill cover lost their tags. What I'm showing in this image with a circle, that's not the gill cover. That's actually a creek chub that lost. It was one of the 6% that lost the tag in the cheek. But where, if you move back on the fish's head, the gill cover is the kind of the big bony flat piece. And it was a nice spot to put a tag because you slid the needle between the skin and the bone. But apparently their bodies are really easily, find it really easy to push the tag out if it's a tag in that location. Next. So some of our conclusions and findings really, both trout and non-trout fish pass these less than 1 meter high dams up and downstream, going in up and downstream directions. There was no significant movement differences among dams and controls, but again, we're talking about measuring differences among what 25 fish decide to do. So it's a small sample size, but it is some data that we get to use. Dam passage is correlated to the duration each dam was overtopped during high flows. In other words, one of the most important things that we learned here was that each dam became passable at different flows. So it's really very unique that every type of dam may have a different type of passability for fish. This impacts, the impacts of these findings are limited by small sample sizes, investigating only small dams. Again, we don't have any data on how fish pass a 4 or 5 foot high dam, or whether there's a threshold where a certain height of a dam just becomes a total fish barrier. We don't know that. We know what they did around dams that are 3 feet or less. And we had to exclude adult steelhead. We don't know how adult steelhead would pass these type of dams either. We have correlations with fish movement where we're seeing fish passage during high flows, But again, it's all with fish that are probably 10 inches or less in length during a time of year in August and September when adult steelhead aren't moving around. They're already gone, they're in Lake Superior. So we don't have anything that we can directly say how an adult steelhead would interact with these dams either. But all these could be addressed with a larger research project in collaboration with Minnesota DNR and local advocacy groups to tag adult steelhead with pit tags, which is a longer term tag in a multi-year study. So we have some great data. We have places to begin discussions. But to answer all of these questions, we'll likely have to take another step. So thank you. I think that was the end of my portion, Karen. So you can do the wrap up.
All right, thanks so much, Josh. I guess I just have sort of final words here. I think the last thing that we wanted to add to our study was that it was designed to look at the impacts of beaver dam removal on low flow hydrology and fish movement with that bonus collection of the temperature data. It wasn't designed to determine whether or not beaver dams should be removed. And that's really a societal decision that needs to weigh not only impacts of target species, but also on other ecosystem benefits associated with having beaver dams present or absent. So there's a lot of species that benefit from free-flowing streams and others that benefit from having ponded water. And so our study can't answer the question of whether or not the dams should be removed, but hopefully the data provide more insight into what's happening in the system when those dams are removed. I think we have, that being said, at least in one instance, we had pretty compelling data that beaver dams were helping keep the groundwater levels high and the stream discharge flowing and temperatures cool in that far upstream dam. That dam was notched in 2021, which led to warm water pouring over the top of the dam instead of cool water seeping through the subsurface. So I think in particular at that location, that practice designed to help trout was probably detrimental to them. So we're hoping that the data that we've collected can help lead to a more nuanced approach to trout management in the Knife River and elsewhere on the North Shore and other northern cold water fisheries. And with that, I just want to close by saying thanks to our funding source, which was Minnesota Sea Grant, as well as to our collaborators and partners and all of the students who helped with this project. And I think at this point, we have time for questions.
Karen and Josh, I have asked people to type their questions into the chat, and I see one there so far. And that one is from Rich Staffen. How much rain does it take to cause overtopping flow, and how frequently do we get those rains?
Sure, I can take that. I don't know. It depends on the dam. So a really small dam might not require a whole lot of precipitation to overtop it. And it also depends on what the beavers do. At one of the sites where we were taking images every hour, we were finding that as there was a small increase in precipitation, so even a drizzle that sustains itself for 6 hours or so, they were down at the dam working feverishly with grass and mud and making the top absolutely level so that the water wouldn't spill over. So that was something that I noticed, is they changed their dams as precipitation events are happening. So it's a little hard to predict exactly when a dam is going to overtop. It can be anything from a ½ an inch of rain to, in some cases, requiring more than that over several days.
So I see a question about how far downstream did the cooling influence prevail? And we were able to track it a couple hundred meters downstream. I think usually by the time you got about a kilometer downstream, you couldn't really see the influence anymore. The data that I was showing you from the site, I can actually go and take a look at that. Let me just, I'll share this really quick because that will allow us to put some numbers on this. So these data here, let's do from current slide. Hopefully you're seeing this. So this is the minimum temperatures, as you can see, stayed cool more than 300 meters downstream. This drop that's most dramatic right downstream from the dam, that lasted, you know, by the time we're at 120 meters, we're sort of within the range, but we're still cooler all the way down 300 meters downstream. I think one of the sites we had another sensor that was a kilometer downstream and you couldn't see the signal at that point. There's a question about the historical prevalence of beavers and dams and steelhead trout versus present day numbers. It seems we haven't been particularly kind to beavers since logging began. I don't know, Josh, do you want to tackle that one?
So anybody who is really interested in that should talk to Marty Rye. He is a local historical expert on beaver prevalence in the area. He's great. So most of how I'll answer this is based off of what I know from talking to Marty. It's hard to say because by the time the logging era began, beaver were already at very low abundances from trapping. The trapping era went through first, then the logging. So I don't know about prevalence in what we would consider our more recent record of history when towns started showing up and newspapers were being written. Beaver were already at really low abundances at that time. So it's a little bit different of a question. And we started adding different fish after that too. We started adding species that weren't here. Our native trout are brook trout and lake trout. And we've added brown and rainbows, cohos, Chinooks. And that changes things too, because we have priorities over some of these introduced species for sport fish, a little more than we do for some of our native fish.
I guess, Josh, I see a question for you from Rodney and Julie Johnson. Is it likely that studies using pit tags or through longer periods of time be successfully funded in the near future?
I'd like to hope so. I don't know. It's hard to really know what funding sources are going to come out and say, this is what we're looking for. And it's hard to predict some of those. Sometimes we can make some really great partnerships with people and have ideas that we talk about. And we have to wait for a long time for the right funding source to come through that would fit our research question. And that's kind of where we're at right now, is I have people that are really interested in learning more about this, but we're kind of still waiting for the right fit for a funder.
Yeah, and I'll add to that most funding is done on 2 to 3 year cycles. So it's a lot harder to get a long-term funding source in place for a study like this. There are a number of places around the country where people do fund, like there's long-term ecological research stations that are funded for decades. And those are really valuable because of the long-term records. I see another fish question.
All right, I see it. The historical data for fish populations before and after white population influence, no beaver removals versus beaver removal. Again, that's, I don't have any information. And the people that I know, the retired fisheries biologists out of the Superior Office, Dennis Pratt and Marty Rye, those two people were going through microfilm stashes in libraries to getting the oldest newspaper records they can find. And so that type of information, just when we start recording things, it doesn't go back very far. It's surprising that you get into, the mid 1800s and there is not much information to go past that, because the white populations weren't prevalent in the area until they started making logging towns. And so, yeah, I just don't have any information about what it was really like.
Looks like the next question, did you look at the underlying geology and correlate with cooling or warming impacts? And future studies could also look at pond morphometry in geologically similar reaches. So the study that I talked about with the instrumentation around several ponds did definitely look at the underlying geology. So that was Hannah's work, and she specifically was looking at one site in the upper part of the watershed where you had loamy soils, you had much deeper soils, and then downstream, much clay-rich soils and shallower depths of bedrock. So those were two very different areas. And as someone who has a geology background, I'm a geomorphologist. I'm particularly interested to see if that those different areas had different responses in terms of the surface and subsurface flow connectivity. And so, yes, that actually did play a role in the work and in the research. Hannah actually developed heat flux models. So she used the data that she collected to try and constrain all the different pathways that heat moves through the system. So all the different ways that the river in particular could lose heat or gain heat. So it would gain heat from solar radiation, it would lose heat if you had cold upwelling, for instance. So she used the subsurface soils as one of the inputs to look at the hydraulic conductivity in those reaches. So they are different. So yes, I guess that's the short answer. And the next statement was actually me. While Josh was talking, Sean Johnson-Weiss also has some really good research out about beaver abundance. In addition, he's looked at the landscape of like all the different places beaver could occupy and have occupied in the past. So that's another source of information. He's got some papers that have come out quite recently. Question about beaver dams built in and around springs. I actually can't answer that. So I don't know if that, other than the ones like that one that we had downstream of the other one where you had upwelling coming up. I don't think I would call that a spring though. That was likely forced from the upstream dam. You know anything about beaver dams and springs, Josh?
I've noticed in other areas, so outside of this project, that it happened more than once that there was a spring upstream of a beaver pond or upstream of a beaver dam. So in the pond somewhere, there was a cold spot that you could detect with a fast acting thermometer when we were looking for cold springs. And it was always a question for us, is that because the beaver were seeking that out? Because remember, in the wintertime, beavers don't want deep ice. They want to be able to get from their lodge to their food cache, and they want to have water depth. So they don't want to have their pond, freezing up. So a spring is actually going to help moderate the winter temperatures and actually keep the water warmer in the wintertime. So we don't actually know, like, do they seek out a spring and place dams where there's going to be a spring in their pond, or is the dam that they make creating a change in the hydraulics of the system and the spring starts to pop out because you're creating pressure on the, the surrounding water table. So I don't know, but I've noticed it several times that there's sometimes a spring upstream of a beaver dam.
Excellent. Looks like the next question asks about the book Eager, and so we read the book Eager and came away thinking it's best to let beavers be and don't control their environments at all. What's your educated opinion? So now we're getting into the element I talked about at the end of our role here is to provide data on what's happening with the beaver dams in place and when they're removed, as opposed to make recommendations. I will note that there are a lot of places out, particularly in the western part of the US, where beavers are actively used in stream restoration projects. So they are trying to reintroduce beavers and also using beaver dam analogs as ways to essentially raise the water table and reconnect channels with floodplains. So there's manipulation going the other direction as well of trying to recreate the habitats that beavers provided in places where their numbers are much lower right now than they used to be. There's a question on how much interest is there in the DNR to learn from this type of research. So I'll give my story, and then if you have stuff to add, Josh, feel free. I got involved in this project because I went to give a talk at the Advocates for the Knife River Watershed meeting. And at the end, we had a long discussion about, hydrology in the Knife and what's happening when these beaver dams are removed. And I mentioned there was concern that they might be impacting low flows. And my first thought was that this project wasn't going to go anywhere unless the DNR also was interested in learning more. So the first thing I did was go and talk to Desiree Hendrickson at the DNR Fisheries Division. And, she expressed interest in learning more about this because they didn't really know. And if they have a management practice in place that's designed to help a particular species and they learn that it's actually not helping that species, that's really important information. So the DNR is an active partner with us on this. They were the ones who did all of the beaver dam notching and removal. So we did not do any of that ourselves. That was done by the DNR. They helped with site selection. They've been very helpful. And so is there interest in learning? I would say absolutely. Josh, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
Yeah, I would also just add that with any research project, but particularly the fish movement portion of this, there's a lot of caveats. So we say we learned this, but there's a lot we didn't look at, and there's a lot that we can't say this information translates directly into all these other ways of applying that information. So I think that that's one of the important things, especially with fish movement, is we got some information. We noticed that fish were able to pass dams if the conditions were right, but that doesn't translate directly into, sure, all steelhead could pass any beaver dam. We don't have that. Our data can't support that. So there's always those types of caveats with any research question that you pursue. You kind of run into these limitations on what your information is really going to be able to turn into management action. You kind of get these little steps where you learn something and you have another question that you need to work on before you can really turn it into a strong management action.
Yes, the next question says 2 of the highlighted dams were only 20 meters apart. Is that unusual or is it determined by topography? And were there many dams you didn't pick? Oh, there were so many dams. So yeah, it's actually really common to get chains of dams. So you have one that backs up to the next one, that backs up to the next one, that backs up to the next one, and so on. And in part, they're protecting each other. We had a really big flow event in June 2018, I think, that blew out one of our stream gauges, and we hit some really high flows. At least one of the beaver dams blew out in a chain, but all the other ones in the chain stayed. So yes, there were lots of dams that we didn't pick. When we were doing site selection, we were looking for places that we could access, that we had landowners who were willing to let us out there, that because we did want to be able to access the land frequently to make measurements. We also wanted to have the dams removed in the second year, so we needed permission for that. And yeah, so I mean, I think we did get pushed up into the upper parts of the watershed in part because we were working in a landscape and in a river system that has been managed with beaver dam removal on the main stem, both by the DNR, but also by some of the angler groups. So there's more than one entity that's out trying to keep the dams off of the main stem channels. So we ended up pretty far upstream in order to work on them, but there were lots of beavers up there. I think the next question is yours, Josh.
Yeah. So I'll add that the paper by Sean Johnson-Bice makes a really good review of beaver management in this area, Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin. And there's really good information in there about duration that beaver colonies are active in a stream. After enough time, it looks like there are some negative influences upon trout. But there seems to be, as Sean Johnson-Bice had found from his reviews, there seems to be a kind of a sweet spot of 1 to 3 years when dams are small and there's not a lot of sediment behind them. And they're creating these pools, but they're not filled with silt yet. They haven't gotten so expansive that the nearby forest is all tipped over into a pond. The dams aren't 5 feet high. And so I think there likely is a threshold of beaver activity in there. but we don't know it. You know, we were able to work around some of the smaller dams. But if you look in some of these areas that have been heavily colonized by beaver for long durations, it's likely that the fish populations are experiencing something different than a dam that is 1 year old, and beaver activity is still relatively minimal, but there is a pond. So there's likely a difference there.
And I think actually there's one other question by Paul Sandstrom. I don't know if you see that scroll up a little bit.
Oh.
I can read it off if you want.
Yeah, maybe I'm not.
Says in the 70s, 80s, there was an
Oh yeah,
extensive
that was the
series
one
of
I was
investigations.
referring to. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I should have
sorry.
said that one was going through. So yes, that was with the longer term information on expansive colonies. And if, as we had mentioned, there are dams that can become quite close together, and so you have all these ponds that turn into there's not much stream left at that point, basically, and it turns into big blobs of muddy looking water. So yes, that's what I was alluding to, is there seems to be a difference in fish populations experience of beaver influenced habitat from a newly established pond 1 to 3 years old versus a colony that's been active in a stream system for a long time, perhaps even decades. And I would expect that the fish populations would experience something different there. The next one on boom and bust cycles.
I feel like you kind of answered that one already to some degree.
Yeah.
So this is saying
Yeah.
actively managing beaver helps to maintain them long-term on the landscape because of their high productivity and mobility, and leaving them unmanaged, they tend to increase in population to the point they eat out their habitat, resulting in a boom bust cycle. So any thought on how that would change their impact on hydrology and temperature, with a follow-up note that maybe we need the wolves around to control the beavers.
Right.
So
Yeah, there's some folks up at Voyagers that are doing a lot of beaver and wolf predation studies, but also measuring kit sizes. And they were finding out that there are big cycles in beaver kit sizes, depending on a positive feedback loop or a negative feedback loop with forage and kind of stress levels and how happy they are. So they can have changes in their big changes in how big each litter that they have is every year. Yes, and wolves they are like the #1 predator of beavers. When they leave a pond, where do they go? So sometimes it's like the juveniles. They're not babies, but they're like the teenagers that get kicked out because mom is about to have another litter. So these teenagers typically roam around until they find a place for them to call home, and they make a dam that's usually pretty shabby. They might not even stay there very long. They might abandon that and move again into another stream, or any place up or downstream on the same watershed. So it's hard to say, exactly how far they move, but I believe some of the folks up at Voyagers doing a lot of these beaver studies would actually know that, because they radio tagged a lot of beavers and watched how they moved.
I think we've caught up on questions. Are there any more?
In our area, they're killed most of the time.
So the question is, when beavers are forcibly removed, does that mean they're killed or moved to a new area? I don't think they allow live trapping, so I think they're killed.
I don't know. All of trapping I know of is usually using a kill method.
We got several things coming in. So who is allowed to remove a beaver dam?
Well, that's I don't know, because it gets a little bit dicey in some of the who's allowed to do what kind of stuff. So obviously the Minnesota DNR were working with, their own crews to notch the dams or remove the beavers. It was a aphis trapper. I can't remember exactly the person that might have done it, but I think that there are rules written about landowners being able to have some control of that. And I believe nearby landowners that have damage being caused to their property from a pond can have some kind of argument to make that the dam needs to be pulled because of flooding on their property. But again, this is all going to involve other people. So I don't know all of the rules. And Paul Sandstrom clarifying that his comment was directed at beaver dams as migration berries to adult steelhead as the habitat upstream of the sites was excellent for rainbows. And it's very possible that the dams that were there were barriers. So we've had other work that I've done with Wisconsin DNR doing electrofishing around beaver impounded areas. And we have documented year-to-year changes from coho salmon coming into the streams and getting up to the dams one year, pull the dams out, and the next year they're, half a mile above where the dam was. And so there's some information out there that beaver dams certainly can be barriers, especially if they're, more than 3 feet high. 3 feet high is about up to your waist. Most of the dams that start getting people's attention are a little bigger than that. And again, we didn't measure fish movement past bigger dams.
Are there studies that compare fish populations in watersheds that heavily manage beaver and watersheds that do not heavily manage beaver?
There is a study I know of going on in Wisconsin, but I don't know much about it. And they were doing, if I remember right, it was set up a little bit like Karen had described, a Bakke study before, after, control, impact. And there were some, there were trout waters, but they were not super high priority spawning areas. And they were going to let beaver come back into some of those. And over time, monitor the fish reproduction before there were beaver, comparing it to when after beaver had started to establish again. And I know it's a multi-year study, and I don't know how far they're into it, but I believe that was one that I knew of, that they were going to try and control as much of the environmental factors as they could, get good pre-data for several years, and then see what happens in a stream that they can keep an eye on when beaver are back in it.
The next question says, the knife system is subject to very low flows that may become worse with climate change. Should a premium be put on water storage by tributaries and selectively choosing the best tributaries as steelhead spawning habitat? I guess this sort of follows along what I was getting at by a nuanced approach to management, sort of the recognition that a number of beaver ponds are in fact providing storage in the watershed, and they're providing cooler water downstream. They may not be trout waters up there, and perhaps the best thing is to leave them intact. The one that I talked about that got notched in 2021 sort of shifted from being a pond that was providing cool water through the subsurface to providing warm water over the top. So that sort of thing should probably not be happening. Do we sit down and figure out which of the tributaries and what areas should be pinned for storage and what should be chosen for steelhead spawning habitat is probably something that that's a question that I can't answer. That needs to go to somebody who's an expert in fish management. But we can say that a number of the beaver ponds are providing storage, are raising the water table, and are providing cool water downstream. So there shouldn't be a blanket approach to how they're handled. And Yeah,
Right.
the tributaries to the mainstem aren't managed the same way as the mainstem right now.
Right.
Already.
And one of the reasons that the knife gets so much attention is because it doesn't have a waterfall near the lake. And so if you go up and down the North Shore and you do a lot of, pull off to hike or anything like that, you'll see almost all of them have big waterfalls that are fish barriers. So the knife doesn't have that. And that's why there's a lot of interest in finding out what would be the best situation in the Knife River for steelhead, because they could actually travel up that river. They wouldn't get to, a few hundred meters in or half a mile in and reach an impassable rock barrier.
And, I think the DNR, decades ago used to manage a lot more watersheds and then have kind of focused in on only a few. So they've cut way back on which ones are managed in terms of beaver dam removal. I think we hit the end of the questions for now.
Well, that was quite a few questions. And I just want to thank you both for a really interesting presentation and wonderful follow-up question and answer. Very interesting. Obviously, to a lot of people, we had 70 people on this presentation at one point. So thank you very much. Thanks to everyone for joining us. I did have a request to repeat the information about the Minnesota Division program next week. And so for those that are interested in that program, that I put the link in the chat. That is going to be next Tuesday, the 22nd at 7 o'clock. And it's on the topic of fire ecology in the boundary waters. So, and again, if you're on Rich's email list, along with other great information, you've gotten a description and a link to that. If you're not on Rich's email list, join the Ikes and you'll be on his email list, and he'll keep you updated about all sorts of really interesting things going on. So thank you to both of our presenters, and thank you everyone for joining us here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye.